The Urantia book, section 3, the history of Urantia, paper 80, the Andite expansion in the Occident. Although the European blue man did not of himself achieve a great cultural civilization, he did supply the biologic foundation, which, when its Adamized strains were blended with the later Andite invaders, produced one of the most potent stocks for the attainment of aggressive civilization ever to appear on Urantia since the times of the Violet Race and their Andite successors. So what is stated here is that the blue man is in actuality of himself a quite aggressive species. So now we can get a deeper understanding of why the aggressiveness in this world is still continued. So that is why it is very good to get a deeper understanding about the different human strains that are still operating unto this day. And that is why God and Christ Michael, whom is the Paradise Creator's son, that they are telling us through this Urantia book an in-depth history about the human strains and the different human species, because everyone looks human, talks human, yeah, and walks like a human, but each person has different human strains in them, and some have human strains in them that makes them far more aggressive than a fellow brother or sister is. So that is why it is of great importance that we start reading the Urantia book ourselves, so that we can get this information in us, because your genes, your DNA recognizes this information. This is directly coming from the Creator, the one and only living, righteous and sovereign source and center of light and life himself, and Christ Michael, his Paradise Creator son, wanted to have us this information so that we can understand why the things are happening as they are happening on Urantia nowadays. And also to set the record straight, because there are a lot of confusions and lies going around on Urantia. And the Bible, as a matter of fact, didn't brought that much good into this world, which is understandable, because if you are going to start reading the Urantia book, then you actually can see that the Bible in many ways lack a lot of truth information, and especially the Old Testament is highly distorted and twisted, and the whole creational story that is such a childlike story, and you can see and read in many ways that it is actually a mythological story that also contains human fantasy. And there are tiny bits of truth in the Old Testament. And if you go with the sieve through it, then I can say you from the 60 books, well, then eventually you would have a Bible that contains just one book. And actually the Psalms and Proverbs are pearls on itself, and the later Old Testament books are interesting to read. There's a far more higher spiritual truth to be found in these, but the earlier books are actually not worth reading. As a matter of fact, the only reason why you should read them is so that you can get a deeper understanding of how our forebears understood the God concept, how they understood God. But the God that you're reading in the first 8 to 12 at least, and I think at least the first 20 books of the Bible, you read nothing more than about a God that is actually a humanized God with human features and characteristics. And that is not what God is. God is pure love. God is our creator. Without him we are nowhere. Without him we wouldn't even reach 2025. If God was not so nice to bestow himself upon us and to bestow a whole spiritual circuitry on us, which are the 7 adjutant mind spirits, highly confused for chakras, which they are not. But even that is something humanity in early days could not grasp, who these 7 adjutant mind spirits are. These are the spirits of wisdom, worship, counsel, knowledge, courage, intuition, and I always forget one, and another one. I always forget one. And then we have the whole circuitry coming from the divine minister. And these 7 adjutant mind spirits also are from the divine minister. And divine minister is actually a daughter of the infinite spirit. It is the universe mother spirit. And because we are living in a local universe known as Nebadon, it is the local universe mother spirit. And she gave us, well, God gave through her to us the ministry of the Holy Spirit, the ministry of the Spirit of Truth, and the ministry of the thought adjuster, that is actually the God, the Father fragment in us. So, and that ministry of the infinite spirit is based on the ministry of mercy. So it's about time that we get to know far more information, and that we start undoing ourselves from all the things that humanity themselves has taught to their fellow brothers and sisters, because all the teachings in this world are unfortunately tremendously distorted. The teachings of Buddha are not the teachings of Buddha anymore. So highly distorted have these teachings become. The same with the teachings of Lao Tzu. I, fortunately, am been guided to teachings of Lao Tzu that has been written down by a great grandson of Lao Tzu himself. And that family line, so to say, has conserved his teachings in a well way. and were very in connection with these teachers that brought these teachings in orally form forward. But not all Lao Tse or Lao Tzu teachings are really trustworthy. In his teachings are also a lot of distortions, and the ones that I have been led to by God the Father himself, they contain a lot of high spiritual truths, and these teachings am I placing as shorties on the YouTube platforms, channels. The Most High Teaches You and Welcome to Urantia, which I have set up with just one goal, to help, not only help, but also to bring forward the entire Urantia book, and to bring forward this fifth epical revelation, because that is what the Urantia book is. It is a fifth epical revelation given to us by God himself, and in this time he chose for a book form because that is easier to be spread around. And the fourth epical revelation came through Michael of Nebadon, whom for this world is better known as Jesus of Nazareth. The third epical revelation came through Adam and Eve. Through Machiaventa Melchizedek, sorry. He was the path shower, the way shower for Michael of Nebadon, so that he could arrive here on Urantia. Machiaventa Melchizedek was here because Urantia was at the brink of becoming a complete dark and evil world. And the spirit, the light of truth, so to say, was almost gone. And to make sure that that would not happen, Machiaventa Melchizedek arrived here on this earth. And the second epical revelation has been brought to us by Adam and Eve. And the first epical revelation has been brought to us by our former planetary prince Caligastia, which unfortunately went astray and betrayed not only the entire universe administration, and not only from this universe, but also from the other universes of universes. Also, he betrayed his own people, and the peoples of Urantia. So we need to know more in-depth information, and what makes me sad is that I still see pastors and evangelists doing fear-mongering toward their fellow brothers and sisters about hell and whatever, but hell does not exist, never was a hell. Do you truly believe that our beloved Creator would send his own children to a realm called hell? No, of course not. He is a loving God. He loves his children one by one deeply, and he shall do everything to wake his child up to the realization that he is the only one stable factor in life, and that he is what is being stated, the rock of life. But he has given his children free will, so each of his children has the free will to choose for him or herself if she wants to return to God. If not, okay, then it's not so. But even when the wicked children of those children of God who became wicked, whom I call our fallen brothers and sisters, whom have detached themselves completely from God and light and life, even if they die and they go to a special resurrection halls in the first mentioned world, they will get the opportunity still to return to God. And I truly believe that many of them eventually, when they get reawakened in the especially created resurrection halls in the first mentioned world, that many of them eventually, if they see their live film, that they then choose for God. I think there are not many of God's children who eventually completely cease out of existence, because that is what happens if you, till the bitter end, are not coming back to God and are not acknowledging for yourself that you are a child of God and have sonship in God. If you still, until the bitter end, refuse this, what happens is that the thought adjuster goes back to Divinington. That is the world of the thought adjusters. That's where their home place is. And then all that was still good in the soul will be taken out. That goes to the Supreme Being. That is the big archive, so to say, for God himself, and the rest ceases out of existence, and then you shall never return. So that is the whole thing, but I truly believe that not many will end up like that. I truly believe that even the ones whom are now causing such a lot of evilness and darkness in this world, that many of them eventually, when they are again woken up in the first, in the resurrection halls in the first mentioned world, and when they see what they have done, and they truly and sincerely repent, then God will embrace them. And then if they indeed acknowledge that they are a child of God and that they have sonship of God, and if they truly want to restore themselves, then they are very much welcome in God's heart. So I truly believe that not many of God's children end in such a way that they completely cease out of existence. And God has given us a free will, which means that He has given us this so that we can choose if we want to continue with our path of ascension. That path of ascension is the path that will lead us to central universe, where God resides, because in the central universe there is the paradise, what is better known for the human race as the kingdom of God. But God does not do in titles, it is just paradise. So that is why I'm doing what I'm doing, because I care about my brethren, I care about my beloved brothers and sisters, whom are also children of the one true living God, just as I am. Alright, I continue. The modern white peoples incorporate the surviving strains of the Adamic stock, which became admixed with the Sangik races, some red and yellow, but more especially the blue. There is a considerable percentage of the original Andonite stock in all the white races, and still more of the early Nodite strains. Andonite stock means that these people have the strains of Andon and Fonta. They were the first human father and human mother. So they have the strains of Andon in them. That makes them that they have a part Andonite in them. One, the Adamites enter Europe. Before the last Andites were driven out of the Euphrates valley, many of their brethren had entered Europe as adventurers, teachers, traders, and warriors. During the earlier days of the violet race, the Mediterranean trough was protected by the Gibraltar isthmus and the Sicilian land bridge. Some of man's very early maritime commerce was established on these inland lakes, where blue men from the north and the Saharans from the south met Nodites and Adamites from the east. In the eastern trough of the Mediterranean, the Nodites had established one of their most extensive cultures, and from these centers had penetrated somewhat of their most extensive cultures, and from these centers had penetrated somewhat of their most extensive cultures, sorry for the repeat, and from these centers had penetrated, and from these, oh sorry, I will read it again. In the eastern trough of the Mediterranean, the Nodites had established one of their most extensive cultures, and from these centers had penetrated somewhat into southern Europe, but more especially into northern Africa. The broad-headed Nodite-Andonite Syrians very early introduced pottery and agriculture. That's early in the morning, it's 4 in the morning. In connection with their settlements on the slowly rising Nile Delta, they also imported sheep, goats, cattle, and other domesticated animals, and brought in greatly improved methods of metalworking. Syria then being the center of that industry. Well, Syria nowadays is completely vanished, so to say. It is one devastating area now, unfortunately. For more than 30,000 years, Egypt received a steady stream of Mesopotamians who brought along their art and culture to enrich that of the Nile Valley. But the ingress of large numbers of the Sahara peoples greatly deteriorated the early civilization along the Nile, so that Egypt reached its lowest cultural level some 15,000 years ago. But during earlier times there was little to hinder the westward migration of the Adamites. The Sahara was an open grazing land overspread by herders and agriculturists. These Saharans never engaged in manufacture, nor were they city builders. They were an indigo-black group. And do not confuse yourselves with this whole indigo concept coming from the New Age. That has nothing to do with this. Indigo is also one of the colored races of the Sangik peoples. It's actually the sixth color, because violet is, I think, the sixth Sangik races, and the violet race is the 7 colored added to the human race. So they were an indigo-black group which carried extensive strains of the extinct green and orange races, but they received a very limited amount of the violet inheritance before the upthrust of land and the shifting water-laden winds dispersed the remnants of this prosperous and peaceful civilization. Adam's blood has been shared with most of the human races, but some secured more than others. the mixed races of India and the darker peoples of Africa were not attractive to the Adamites. So they did not really mate with these people. So these people have the least amount of Adamic life plasm in them, which also explains why most of the African social cultures are still outliving a primitive way of living. And this could also explain why most of these native tribes and so on still are living in primitiveness, because they never ever really evolved. They are standing still, so to say. So because they miss actually this Adamic life plasm, it doesn't say that they could not come out of that. It's also a state of willingness. If you as a tribe are willing to grow further and to grow beyond primitiveness, then everything is possible, and that is possible and still possible. It's more like if the tribe itself wants it. They would have mixed freely with the red men, and had he not been far removed in the Americas, and they were kindly disposed toward the yellow man, but he was likewise difficult of access in faraway Asia. Therefore, when actuated by either adventure or altruism, or when driven out of the Euphrates valley, they very naturally chose union with the blue races of Europe. The blue men, then dominant in Europe, had no religious practices which were repulsive to the earlier migrating Adamites, and there was a great sex attraction between the violet and the blue races. The best of the blue men deemed it a high honor to be permitted to mate with the Adamites. Every blue man entertained the ambition of becoming so skillful and artistic as to win the affection of some Adamite women, and it was the highest aspiration of a superior blue woman to receive the attention of an Adamite male. What I can read here is that the Adamites were not really a very adventurous people, because if they were really adventurous, then they also would have go to Asia and the Americas. So they were not really that much adventurous type of people. Slowly, these migrating sons of Eden united with the higher types of the blue race, invigorating their cultural practices while ruthlessly exterminating the lingering strains of Neanderthal stock. This technique of race blending, combined with the elimination of inferior strains, produced a dozen or more virile and progressive groups of superior blue men, one of which you have denominated the Cro-Magnons. For these and other reasons, not the least of which was a more favorable paths of migration, the early waves of Mesopotamian culture made their way almost exclusively to Europe, and it was these circumstances that that determined the antecedents of modern European civilization. 2. Climatic and geologic changes. The earlier expansion of the violet race into Europe was cut short by certain rather sudden climatic and geologic changes. With the retreat of the northern ice fields, the water-laden winds from the west shifted to the north, gradually turning the great open pasture regions of Sahara into a barren desert. This drought dispersed the smaller saturated brunettes, dark-eyed but long-headed dwellers of the Great Sahara Plateau. And actually it's interesting that the father of Joshua ben Joseph, who later became Jesus of Nazareth, he was a brunette type, skin-colored type of man, and his mother Mary was actually very blonde. So where this black Jesus is coming from, I don't know, but I think that is completely based on so many distortions and confusions taught forward by heavily confused brothers and sisters who want to believe that Jesus was black because that suits them the very most, because unfortunately many black people still find themselves as a minority among the rest, so they do everything to bring themselves out of this position of minority. And I think this whole black Jesus idea is created out of this, to give the black people a place in the world, to give themselves a place in society too, because they are still suffering from the past. But Jesus was not black. He was mixed. He was, what I say, his father was a brunette, skin-colored man, and his mother was a blonde woman. So blonde and brunette, I don't see how that becomes black. The purer indigo elements moved southward to the forests of Central Africa, where they have ever since remained. The more mixed groups spread out in three directions. The superior tribes to the west migrated to Spain and thence to adjacent parts of Europe, forming the nucleus of the later Mediterranean long-headed brunette races. The least progressive division to the east of the Sahara Plateau migrated to Arabia and thence through northern Mesopotamia and India to faraway Ceylon. The central group moved north and east to the Nile Valley and into Palestine. It is this secondary Sangik substratum that suggests a certain degree of kinship among the modern peoples scattered from the Deccan through Iran, and Deccan is India area, through Iran, Mesopotamia, and along both shores of the Mediterranean Sea. About the time of these climatic changes in Africa, England separated from the continent and Denmark arose from the sea, while the isthmus of Gibraltar, protecting the western basin of the Mediterranean, gave way as the result of an earthquake, quickly raising this inland lake to the level of the Atlantic Ocean. Presently, the Sicilian land bridge submerged, creating one sea of the Mediterranean and connecting it with the Atlantic Ocean. This cataclysm of nature flooded scores of human settlements and occasioned the greatest loss of life by flood in all the world's history. This engulfment of the Mediterranean basin immediately curtailed the westward movements of the Adamites, while the great influx of Saharans led them to seek outlets for their increasing numbers to the north and east of Eden. As the descendants of Adam journeyed northward from the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, they encountered mountainous barriers and the then expanded Caspian Sea, and for many generations the Adamites hunted, herded, and tilled the soil around their settlements scattered throughout Turkestan. Slowly, this magnificent people extended their territory into Europe, but now the Adamites enter Europe from the east and find the culture of the blue man thousands of years behind that of Asia, since this region has been almost entirely out of touch with Mesopotamia. 3. The Cro-Magnoid blue man. The ancient centers of the culture of the blue man were located along all the rivers of Europe, but only the Somme now flows in the same channel which it followed during pre-glacial times. While we speak of the blue man as pervading the European continent, there were scores of racial types. Even 35,000 years ago, the European blue races were already a highly blended people carrying strains of both red and yellow. So they were carrying strains from the red Sangik and the yellow Sangik, while on the Atlantic coastlands and in the regions of present-day Russia, they had absorbed a considerable amount of Andonite blood, and to the south were in contact with the Saharan peoples. But it would be fruitless to attempt to enumerate the many racial groups. The European civilization of this early post-Adamic period was a unique blend of the vigor and art of the blue men with the creative imagination of the Adamites. The blue men were a race of great vigor, but they greatly deteriorated the cultural and spiritual status of the Adamites. It was very difficult for the latter to impress their religion upon the Cro-Magnoids because of the tendency of so many to cheat and to debauch. The maidens, for 10,000 years, religion in Europe was at a low ebb as compared with the developments in India and in Egypt. The blue men were perfectly honest in all their dealings and were wholly free from the sexual vices of the mixed Adamites. They respected maidenhood, only practicing polygamy when war produced a shortage of males. So then they found a reason to be with more than just one woman. These Cro-Magnon peoples were a brave and far-seeing race. They maintained an efficient system of child culture. Both parents participated in these labors, and the services of the older children were fully utilized. Each child was carefully trained in the care of the caves, in art and in flint making, and an early age and in and at an early age the women were well versed in the domestic arts and in crude agriculture, while the men were skilled hunters and courageous warriors. The blue men were hunters, fishers, and food gatherers. They were expert boat builders. They made stone axes, cut down trees, erected log huts partly below ground, and roofed with hides. And there are peoples who still build similar huts in Siberia. The southern Cro-Magnons generally lived in caves and grottos. It was not uncommon during the rigors of a winter for their sentinels standing on night guard at cave entrances to freeze to death. They had courage, but above all they were artists. The Adamic mixture suddenly accelerated creative imagination. The height of the blue man's art was about 15,000 years ago, before the days when the darker-skinned races came north from Africa through Spain. About 15,000 years ago, the alpine forests were spreading extensively. The European hunters were being driven to the river valleys and to the seashores by the same climatic coercion that had turned the world's happy hunting grounds into dry and barren deserts. As the rain winds shifted to the north, the great open grazing lands of Europe became covered by forests. These great and already sudden climatic modifications drove the races of Europe to change from open space hunters to herders, and in some measure to fishers and tillers of the soil. These changes, while resulting in cultural advances, produced certain biologic retrogressions. During the previous hunting era, the superior tribes had biologic retrogressions, and during the previous hunting era, the superior tribes had intermarried with the higher types of war captives and had unvaryingly destroyed those whom they deemed inferior. But as they commenced to establish settlements and engage in agriculture and commerce, they began to save many of the mediocre captives as slaves, and it was the progeny of these slaves that subsequently so greatly deteriorated the whole Cro-Magnon type. This retrogression of culture continued until it received a fresh impetus from the east when the final and en masse invasion of the Mesopotamians swept over Europe, quickly absorbing the Cro-Magnon type and culture and initiating the civilization of the white races. For the Andite invasions of Europe. While the Andites poured into Europe in a steady stream, there were 7 major invasions, the last arrivals coming on horseback in 3 great waves. Some entered Europe by way of the inlands of the Aegean and up the Danube Valley. But the majority of the earlier and purer strains migrated to northwestern Europe by the northern route across the grazing lands of the Volga and the Don. Between the 3rd and 4th invasions, a horde of Andonites entered Europe from the north, having come from Siberia by way of the Russian rivers and the Baltic. They were immediately assimilated by the northern Andite tribes. The earlier expansions of the purer violet race were far more pacific than were those of their later semi-military and conquest-loving Andite descendants. The Adamites were pacific, the Nodites were belligerent. The union of these stocks, as later mingled with the Sangik races, produced the able, aggressive Andites who made actual military conquests. But the horse was the evolutionary factor which determined the dominance of the Andites in the Occident. The horse gave the dispersing Andites the hitherto non-existent advantage of mobility, enabling the last groups of Andite cavalrymen to progress quickly around the Caspian Sea to overrun all of Europe. All previous waves of Andites had moved so slowly that they tended to disintegrate at any great distance from Mesopotamia, but these later waves moved so rapidly that they reached Europe as coherent groups, still retaining some measure of higher culture. The whole inhabited world outside of China and the Euphrates region had made a very limited cultural progress for 10,000s of years, when the hard-riding Andite horsemen made their appearance in the 6th and 7th millenniums before Christ, as they moved westward across the Russian plains, absorbing the best of the blue men and exterminating the worst. And you can say actually this whole story that I'm reading is in some way, shape or form still present unto the day of today, but we do not see the people anymore dressed up as they were in early days, but the wars that are going on are actually still tribal based wars, and one tribe wants to have what the other has, and so on, so on. And now, with all the things that are going on nowadays, it's all based on a warfare, tribal warfare. Absorbing the best of the blue men and exterminating the worst, they became blended into one people. These were the ancestors of the so-called Nordic races, the forefathers of the Scandinavian, German and Anglo-Saxon peoples. And the most of the people here in the Netherlands are actually from an Anglo-Saxon background. So now you know what the racial strains are from the Scandinavians, Germans and Anglo-Saxon peoples, what they have in their DNA. And now we can get a better understanding of the things that are happening right now, and I think that those whom are corrupting the entire political and judicial system are actually the deteriorated version of this blended human race, this blue man with Andite strains and two of the Sangik race strains, the red and the yellow. So I have the idea that we now see actually a deteriorated version of these blue man species, so to say, and that the distorted, deteriorated version is now operating in a political body, in the justice system, and so on. It was not long before the superior blue strains had been fully absorbed by the Andites throughout all northern Europe. Only in Lapland and to a certain extent in Brittany did the older Andonites retain even a semblance of identity. 5. The Andite conquest of Northern Europe. The tribes of Northern Europe were being continuously reinforced and upstepped by the steady stream of migrants from Mesopotamia through the Turkestan South Russian regions, and when the last waves of the Andite cavalry swept over Europe, there were already more men with Andite inheritance in that region than were to be found in all the rest of the world. For 3,000 years, the military headquarters of the northern Andites was in Denmark. So this means that this area, so the Scandinavian area, the German area, and the entire all these lands, nations, so to speak, that are part of the Anglo-Saxon area, the peoples over there and the peoples in that you can say group, these are having still quite a these are still related to Andites and having Andite strain in them. And if you know that, and the Andite later became a more aggressive species, well, maybe that explains why we are experiencing for quite too long time such an aggressiveness in Europe. So we need to see this, and that is why it's of importance that we get to know more about the human species and what are the strains in each one of us, because each one of us has something of these mentioned strains. So from this central point there went forth the successive waves of conquest, which grew decreasingly Andite and increasingly white as the passing centuries witnessed the final blending of the Mesopotamian conquerors with the conquered peoples. while the blue men had been absorbed in the north and eventually succumbed to the white cavalry raiders who penetrated the south. The advancing tribes of the mixed white race met with stubborn and protracted resistance from the Cro-Magnons, but superior intelligence and ever-augmenting biologic reserves enabled them to wipe the older race out of existence. And if a race is wiped out of existence, doesn't mean it is not there still in our DNA. The decisive struggles between the white men and the blue men were fought out in the valley of the Somme. Here the flower of the blue race bitterly contested the southward moving Andites, and for over 500 years these Cro-Magnoids successfully defended their territories before succumbing to the superior military strategy of the white invaders. Thor, the victorious commander of the armies of the north in the final battle of the Somme, became the hero of the northern white tribes and later on was revered as a so-called god by some of them. Well, not some of them, by the majority of them, because it is the majority is still seeing him as a so-called god. So now we get the deeper understanding how humanity creates their own personal gods out of their so-called human heroes. So a person becomes a hero because of all the deeds that he has done, and then that human being starts to become idolized and later turns into a god figure. So now we know where this whole idea comes from, gods and so on. Well, these are not gods, of course, because there is just one God, and that's the Creator himself, the one and only sovereign and righteous source and center of light and life. And beside him there is no one. The strongholds of the blue men which persisted longest were in southern France, but the last great military resistance was overcome along the Somme. The later conquest progressed by commercial penetration, population pressure along the rivers, and by continued intermarriage with the superiors, coupled with the ruthless extermination of the inferiors. When the tribal council of the Andite elders had adjudged an inferior captive to be benefit, I lost track here. When the tribal council of the Andite elders had adjudged an inferior captive to be unfit, he was by elaborate ceremony committed to the shaman priests, who escorted him to the river and administered the rites of initiation to this, between quotation marks, happy hunting grounds. Lethal submergence. In this way, the white invaders of Europe exterminated all peoples encountered who were not quickly absorbed into their own ranks, and thus did the blue men come to an end, and quickly. The Cro-Magnoid blue men constituted the biologic foundation for the modern European race. but they have survived only as absorbed by the later and virile conquerors of their homelands. The blue strain contributed many sturdy traits and much physical vigor to the white races of Europe, but the humor and imagination of the blended European peoples were derived from the Andites. An Andite is actually a blend coming from the Adamites and the Nodites. These two groups blended with each other and from there became the Andite. This Andite blue union resulting in the northern white races produced an immediate lapse of Andite civilization, a retardation of a transient nature. Eventually, the latent superiority of these northern barbarians manifested itself and culminated in present-day European civilization. By 5000 BC, the evolving white races were dominant throughout all of northern Europe, including northern Germany, northern France, and the British Isles. Central Europe was for some time controlled by the Blue Men and the round-headed Andonites. The latter were mainly situated in the Danube Valley and were never entirely displaced by the Andites. 6. The Andites along the Nile, and then I think, okay, there are 9 subchapters. The Andites along the Nile. From the times of the terminal Andite migrations, culture declined in the Euphrates Valley, and the immediate center of civilization shifted to the valley of the Nile. Egypt became the successor of Mesopotamia as the headquarters of the most advanced group on earth. The Nile Valley began to suffer from floods shortly before the Mesopotamian valleys, but fared much better. This early setback was more than compensated by the continuing stream of Andite immigrants, so that the culture of Egypt, though really derived from the Euphrates region, seemed to forge ahead. But in 5000 BC, during the flood period in Mesopotamia, there were 7 distinct groups of human beings in Egypt. All of them, save one, came from Mesopotamia. When the last exodus from the Euphrates Valley occurred, Egypt was fortunate in gaining so many of the most skillful artists and artisans. These Andite artisans found themselves quite at home in that they were thoroughly familiar with river life, its floods, irrigations, and dry seasons. They enjoyed the sheltered position of the Nile Valley. They were there much less subject to hostile raids and attacks that along the Euphrates, and they added greatly to the metalworking skill of the Egyptians. Here they worked iron ores coming from Mount Sinai instead of from the Black Sea regions. And then the Egyptians very early assembled their municipal deities into an elaborate national system of gods. They developed an extensive theology and had an equally extensive but burdensome priesthood. Several different leaders sought to revive the remnants of the early religious teachings of the Sethite, but these endeavors were short-lived. The Andite peoples built the first stone structures in Egypt. The first and most exquisite of the stone pyramids was erected by Imhotep, an Andite architectural genius. while serving as prime minister. Previous buildings had been constructed of brick, and while many stone structures had been erected in different parts of the world, this was the first in Egypt, but the art of building steadily declined from the days of this great architect. So this means that what people think about all these pyramids, that they would have been built by aliens and whatever, is actually comes in another daylight, because as we read here, they have been built by very intelligent human species. This brilliant epoch of culture was cut short by internal warfare along the Nile, and the country was soon overrun, as Mesopotamia had been, by the inferior tribes from inhospitable Arabia and by the blacks from the south. As a result, social progress steadily declined for more than 500 years. And then point 7, Andites of the Mediterranean Isles. During the decline of culture in Mesopotamia, there persisted for some time a superior civilization on the islands of the eastern Mediterranean. About 12,000 BC, a brilliant tribe of Andites migrated to Crete. This was the only island settled so early by such a superior group, and it was almost 2,000 years before the descendants of these mariners spread to the neighboring isles. This group were the narrow-headed, smaller statured Andites, who had intermarried with the Vanite division of the northern Nodites. And the descendants of Van. Van was a leader of the Nodites, one of the leaders of the Nodites. They were all larger and inferior fellows. These emigrants to Crete were highly skilled in textiles, metals, pottery, plumbing, and the use of stone for building material. They engaged in writing and carried on as herders and agriculturists. Almost 2,000 years after the settlement of Crete, a group of the tall descendants of Adamson made their way over the North Islands to Greece, coming almost directly from their highland home north of Mesopotamia. These progenitors of the Greeks were led westward by Sato, a direct descendant of Adamson and Rata. Rata was the lovely lady of Adamson. The group which finally settled in Greece consisted of 375 of the selected and superior people, comprising the end of the second civilization of the Adamsonites. Adamsonites, those descendants of Adamson, the son of Adam. These later sons of Adamson carried the then most valuable strains of the emerging white races. Adamson means son of Adam. They were of a high intellectual order and physically regarded the most beautiful of men since the days of the first Eden. Presently, Greece and the Aegean Islands region succeeded Mesopotamia and Egypt as the occidental center of trade, art, and culture. But as it was in Egypt, so again practically all of the art and science of the Aegean world was derived from Mesopotamia, except for the culture of the Adamsonite forerunners of the Greeks. All the art and genius of these latter people is a direct legacy of the posterity of Adamson, the first son of Adam and Eve, and his pure Nodite staff of Prince Caligastia. No wonder the Greeks had mythological traditions that they were directly descended from so-called gods and superhuman beings. Yet they were descendants of superhuman beings, because Adamson, Adam, was a superhuman being, and his son was a superhuman being also in some way, shape or form. The Aegean region passed through 5 distinct cultural stages, each less spiritual than the preceding, and ere long the last glorious era of art perished beneath the weight of the rapidly multiplying mediocre descendants of the Danubian slaves who had been imported by the later generations of Greeks. It was during this age in Crete that the, between quotation marks, mother cult of the descendants of Cain attained its greatest vogue. This cult glorified Eve. Later on, this cult changed in glorifying Mary, the mother of Jesus. So now we know where this Hail Mary comes from, and this idea of Mother Mary, and so on, so on, so on. All this Mary idolization. But the main root is laid in glorifying Eve. So this cult glorified Eve in the worship of the, between quotation marks, the Great Mother. Images of Eve were everywhere. That happens. That is why Michael of Nebadon was being said by his elder brother Emmanuel that he was not allowed to leave any writings and pictures and other forms of art behind him when he was about to leave Urantia, when the time would be there to finish off his 7th bestowal. So that is why we do not have any images, writings or whatever art from Jesus. That is the main thing, because they knew in the universe, the universal administration, the universal administrative council, knew that humans here on Urantia are very fond of idolizing and hero culture, because that is what is deeply rooted here on Urantia, this hero culture, this idolization of others that are more great than their fellow brothers and sisters are. Images of Eve were everywhere. Thousands of public shrines were erected throughout Crete and Asia Minor, and this mother cult persisted on down to the times of Christ, becoming later incorporated in the early Christian religion under the guise of the glorification and worship of Mary, the earth mother of Jesus. So now we have the background understanding of this whole idolization, glorification of this Mary. By about 6500 BC, there had occurred a great decline in the spiritual heritage of the Andites. The descendants of Adam were widespreadly dispersed and had been virtually swallowed up in the older and more numerous human races, and this decadence of Andite civilization, together with the disappearance of their religious standards, left the spiritually impoverished races of the world in a deplorable condition. By 5000 BC, the three purest strains of Adam's descendants were in Sumeria, Northern Europe, and Greece. The whole of Mesopotamia was being slowly deteriorated by the stream of mixed and darker races which infiltrated in from Arabia, and the coming of these inferior peoples contributed further to the scattering abroad of the biologic and cultural residue of the Andites. From all over the Fertile Crescent, the more adventurous peoples poured westward to the islands. These migrants cultivated both grain and vegetables, and they brought domesticated animals with them. About 5000 BC, a mighty host of progressive Mesopotamians moved out of the Euphrates valley and settled upon the island of Cyprus. This civilization was wiped out about 2000 years subsequently by the barbarian hordes from the north. Another great colony settled on the Mediterranean near the later site of Carthage, and from North Africa large numbers of Andites entered Spain and later mingled in Switzerland with their brethren who had earlier come to Italy from the Aegean Islands. When Egypt followed Mesopotamia in cultural decline, many of the more able and advanced families fled to Crete, thus greatly augmenting this already advanced civilization. And when the arrival of inferior groups from Egypt later threatened the civilization of Crete, the more cultured families moved on west to Greece. The Greeks were not only great teachers and artists, they were also the world's greatest traders and colonizers. Before succumbing to the flood of inferiority which eventually engulfed their art and commerce, they succeeded in planting so many outposts of culture to the west that a great many of the advances in early Greek civilization persisted in the later peoples of southern Europe, and many of the mixed descendants of these Adamsonites became incorporated in the tribes of the adjacent mainlands. Then 8. The Danubian Andonites. The Andite peoples of the Euphrates valley migrated north to Europe to mingle with the blue men, and west into the Mediterranean regions to mix with the remnants of the commingled Saharans and the southern blue men. And these two branches of the white races were and now are widely separated by the broad-headed mountain survivors of the earlier Andonite tribes, which had long inhabited these central regions. These descendants of Andon were dispersed through most of the mountainous regions of central and southeastern Europe. They were often reinforced by arrivals from Asia Minor, which region they occupied in considerable strength. The ancient Hittites stemmed directly from the Andonite stock. Their pale skins and broad heads were typical of that race. This strain was carried in Abraham's ancestry and contributed much to the characteristic facial appearance of his later Jewish descendants, who, while having a cultural and religion derived from the Andites, spoke a very different language. Their tongue was distinctly Andonite, which means their tongue was distinctly Andonite, was the language of Andon and Fonta. The tribes that dwelt in houses erected on piles or log piers over the lakes of Italy, Switzerland, and southern Europe were the expanding fringes of the African, Aegean, and more especially the Danubian migrations. The Danubians were Andonites, farmers and herders who had entered Europe through the Balkan Peninsula and were moving slowly northward by way of the Danube Valley. They made pottery and tilled the land, preferring to live in the valleys. The most northerly settlement of the Danubians was at Liège in Belgium. So this is interesting, that Liège is the peoples over there can contain Andonite strain in them. So it's interesting if you want to find that out yourself, if that is the case, but because most of the people here on Earth have no clue of the many human strains that are available here on Earth, you do not think about that. And that's funny because I actually quite like the Belgian people very much. These tribes deteriorated rapidly as they moved away from the center and source of their culture. The best pottery is the product of the earlier settlements. The Danubians became mother worshippers as the result of the work of the missionaries from Crete. These tribes later amalgamated with groups of Andonite sailors who came by boats from the coast of Asia Minor and who were also mother worshippers. Much of Central Europe was thus early settled by these mixed types of the broad-headed white races, which practiced mother worship and the religious rite of cremating the dead, for it was the custom of the mother cultists to burn their dead in stone huts, which became later the urns. Yeah, so cremation is not what people think nowadays it is, but it has a far more different background, and it's in actuality it stems from a religious rite based and coming forth and out of and from this whole mother cult worship. 9, the last one of this paper, the three white races, the racial blends in Europe toward the close of the Andite migrations became generalized into the three white races as follows. 1, the northern white race. This so-called Nordic race consisted primarily of the blue man plus the Andite, which means some Adamite and Andonite. but also contained a considerable amount of the Andonite blood. Together with smaller amounts of the red and yellow Sangik races, the northern white race thus encompassed these four most desirable human stocks. But the largest inheritance was from the blue man, the typical early Nordic was long-headed, tall and blonde. But long ago this race became thoroughly mixed with all of the branches of the white peoples. The primitive culture of Europe, which was encountered by the invading Nordics, was that of the retrograding Danubians blended with the blue man, the Nordic, Danish and the Danubian Andonite. So Denmark, there we have Danubian, so it is in the name of Denmark is already being said that they are a blend from the Danubian. Andonite, so many Danish people have these strains in them, Andonite and blue man strains, human strains. Cultures met and mingled on the Rhine, as is witnessed by the existence of two racial groups in Germany today. The Nordics continued the trade in amber from the Baltic coast, building up a great commerce with the broadheads of the Danube Valley with the Brenner Pass, the famous Brenner Pass. This extended contact with the Danubians led these northerners into mother worship. So here this whole mother worship became more and more widespread. And for several thousands of years, cremation of the dead was almost universal throughout Scandinavia. This explains why remains of the earlier white races, although buried all over Europe, are not to be found, only their ashes in stone and clay urns. These white men also built dwellings. They never lived in caves. And again, this explains why there are so few evidences of the white man's early culture. So actually you can say that the white races, and those who were participants in this whole mother worship cultus, they actually erased their own history. So their descendants would not have any real history about their forebears. Although the preceding Cro-Magnon type is well preserved, where it has been securely sealed up in caves and grottos, as it were one day in northern Europe, there is a primitive culture of the retrogressing Danubians and the blue man, and the next that of a suddenly appearing and vastly superior white man. To the central white race, while this group includes strains of blue, yellow and Andite, it is predominantly Andonite. These people are broad-headed, swarthy and stocky. They are driven like a wedge between the Nordic and Mediterranean races, with the broad base resting in Asia and the apex penetrating eastern France. For almost 20,000 years, the Andonites had been pushed farther and farther to the north of Central Asia by the Andites. By 3000 BC, increasing aridity was driving these Andonites back into Turkestan. This Andonite push southward continued for over 1,000 years, and splitting around the Caspian and Black Seas, penetrated Europe by way of both the Balkans and the Ukraine. This is interesting. So maybe we get here a certain clue about the war that is going on for far too long time in the Ukraine area. Not only Ukraine itself, but its entire area. Probably we have to deal here, and we are dealing here with tribal issues. And issues that a human strain is trying to wipe out another human strain, or another thing to have that a human strain is trying to blend the other human strain in such a way that they eventually can dominate the entire Ukraine area. Not only Ukraine itself, but also the entire area around the Ukraine. So maybe we get here food for thought about the whole Russia, Ukraine, America, a war script that is now for a too long time going on. And as we all know, the American governmental system is very corrupt, and the people that are running the American political system, we should ask ourselves more questions about whom they truly are. What are the human strains that are very dominant in these people? And why is it that they wanna conquer entire Europe and eventually want to have entire Europe in their pocket? Because that is exactly what is going on. They are trying to get entire Europe in their pocket. But why? What is going on here? So what are the human strains in these people whom are running the American political system? So this is something we need to ponder upon, and need to contemplate upon, and need to meditate upon. This should be a question that you should ask God the Father an answer for. So this invasion included the remaining groups of Adamson's descendants, and during the later half of the invasion period. So maybe there are still there in that area, that Ukraine area, Russia area, that have Adamson strains in them. And maybe there's a group that wants to deteriorate or wipe out the Adamson strain, and thus wipe out Adam's life plasm. Who knows? But there's more to this whole Ukraine, Russia, America triangle war script. Carried with its considerable numbers of the Iranian Andites, as well as many of the descendants of the Sethite priests. By 2500 BC, the westward thrust of the Andonites reached Europe, and this overrunning of all Mesopotamia, Asia Minor, and the Danube basin by the barbarians of the hills of Turkestan constituted the most serious and lasting of all cultural setbacks up to that time. These invaders definitely Andonized the character of the Central European races, which have ever since remained characteristically Alpine. And then the third group is the Southern White race. This brunette Mediterranean race consisted of a blend of the Andite and the blue man with a smaller Andonite strain than in the north. This group also absorbed a considerable amount of secondary Sangik blood through the Saharans. In later times, this southern division of the white race was infused by strong Andite elements from the eastern Mediterranean. The Mediterranean coastlands did not, however, become permeated by the Andites until the times of the great nomadic invasions of 2500 BC. Land traffic and trade were nearly suspended during these centuries when the nomads invaded the eastern Mediterranean districts. This interference with land travel brought about the great expansion of sea traffic and trade. Mediterranean seaborne commerce was in full swing about 4,500 years ago, and this development of marine traffic resulted in the sudden expansion of the descendants of the Andites throughout the entire coastal territory of the Mediterranean basin. These racial mixtures laid the foundations for the southern European race, the most highly mixed of all, and since these days this race has undergone still further admixtures, notably with the blue, yellow Andite peoples of Arabia. This Mediterranean race is in fact so freely admixed with the surrounding peoples as to be virtually indiscernible as a separate type, but in general its members are short, long-headed and brunette. In the north, the Andites, through warfare and marriage, obliterated the blue men, but in the south they survived in greater numbers. The Basques and the Berbers represent the survival of two branches of this race, but even these peoples have been thoroughly admixed with the Saharans. This was the picture of race mixture presented in Central Europe about 3000 BC. In spite of the partial Adamic default, the higher types did blend. These were the times of the New Stone Age, overlapping the oncoming Bronze Age. In Scandinavia was the Bronze Age, associated with mother worship. In southern France and Spain it was the New Stone Age, associated with sun worship. This was the time of the building of the circular and roofless sun temples. The European white races were energetic builders, delighting to set up great stones as tokens to the sun, much as did their later day descendants at Stonehenge. The vogue of sun worship indicates that this was a great period of agriculture in southern Europe. And beneath the Stonehenge, where all these rocks are is actually what they have found out also a what was it, an burial place. The superstitions of this comparatively recent sun-worshipping era even now persists in the folk ways of Brittany. Although Christianized for over 1500 years, these Bretons still retain charms of the New Stone Age for warding off the evil eye. They still keep thunderstones in the chimney as protection against lightning. The Bretons never mingled with the Scandinavian Nordics. They are survivors of the original Andonite inhabitants of Western Europe mixed with the Mediterranean stock. But it is fallacy to presume to classify the white peoples as Nordic, Alpine and Mediterranean. There has been altogether too much blending to permit such a grouping. At one time, there was a fairly well-defined division of the white race into such classes, but widespread intermingling has since occurred, and it is no longer possible to identify these distinctions with any clarity. Even in 3000 BC, the ancient social groups were no more of one race than are the present inhabitants of North America. This European culture for 5000 years continued to grow and to some extent intermingle, but the barrier of language prevented the full but the barrier of language prevented the full reciprocation of the various Occidental nations. So during the past century, this culture has been experiencing its best opportunity for blending in the cosmopolitan population of North America, and the future of that continent will be determined by the quality of the racial factors which are permitted to enter into its present and future populations, as well as by the level of the social culture which is maintained. And so now arises this question that you also can ponder upon and meditate upon, is why is it that those who try to rule this world wants to know your DNA? And why in 2020 were the human races enforced by those who try to rule the rest of their fellow brothers and sisters? Why were they so enforcing in doing all these PR testings? Why is it that they want to collect as much as possible DNA from all the peoples on this earth? Well, maybe they are trying to find out who is a descendant of Adam and who is a descendant of Adam's son, who is a descendant from Andon. And so they try to wipe out, probably, if they find out the percentages of those who have still a huge percentage of one of these human strains, one of these 3 human strains, maybe they want to have them wiped out. I don't know, but there is a reason why they are so obsessive about the DNA of humans. Why is this whole human genome project there? Why is it that they have created this entire human genome project? What is the actual reason behind this? We should question ourselves this. Now we know more about the racial strains in the human DNA that are available in the human DNA. So we need to ask questions, really questions, and only with such questions can we find out the real reasons why things are so being tremendously pushed, and why this obsession of DNA is there. Alright, with this said, I have come to the end of reading paper 80. All the information in this paper has been presented to us by a lovely Archangel of Nebadon, and I want to say thank you so much, Archangel of Nebadon, for presenting us this information. Thank you for this, and thank you for giving us a more in-depth understanding of the migrations and emigrations of the many different human races, and so that we can get a deeper understanding of why the things happen as they are happening right now here on Earth. And with this said, I want to thank you so much for listening to this audio video. I wish you a beautiful, joyful, loving, inspirational day, and that your entire day is in alignment with the will of God the Father in heaven, known as the Paradise Father in the central universe. And that and as last, I want to say, God bless you.